When Clara Whitmore found herself on the auction block, her late husband's gambling debts forcing her into a marriage she never chose, the highest bidder seemed destined to own both her and her unborn child. But then a silent cowboy in a weathered duster stepped forward with an offer that stunned the entire town and a condition that would change everything. What could possibly make a stranger willing to pay $500 for a woman's freedom instead of her servitude? The rope around Clara's wrists felt like fire against her skin as she stumbled up the wooden steps. Her bare feet found each plank, splinters digging into her heels with every movement forward. The crowd below buzzed like angry wasps, their voices mixing together until she couldn't tell one person from another. "Move along, widow," growled the man pushing her toward the platform. His breath smelled like whiskey and tobacco, making her stomach twist into knots. Clara tried to stand straight, but her legs shook like leaves in a storm. 3 weeks ago, she had been Clara Whitmore, wife of Thomas, living in their small house on Maple Street. Today, she was nothing more than property to be sold. The baby growing inside her belly made everything harder. Each step up those wooden stairs felt like walking toward the edge of a cliff. The autumn morning air bit at her face, sharp and cold. Dust swirled around the town square, kicked up by horses and wagons. Clara could smell coffee brewing from the general store, bread baking at Miller's shop, and the leather from the saddlemaker's place. Normal smells for a normal day, except nothing about this day was normal. Her fingers found the small cameo pin hidden under her shawl. It had belonged to her mother, passed down when Clara was just 16. The smooth ivory felt warm against her palm, like holding onto a piece of love in a world that had turned cold and cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen," shouted a voice that cut through the morning air like a knife through butter. Clara looked up to see Silas Crane standing behind his wooden podium, his black coat spotless and his mustache waxed to perfect points. He smiled, but his eyes were cold as winter ice. "We gather here today to settle the debts of the late Thomas Whitmore," Crane continued, his voice carrying across the square. "As you all know, Mr. Whitmore left behind gambling debts that must be paid. His widow, Clara, along with the child she carries, will be sold to the highest bidder." Clara's knees almost gave out. The words hit her like physical blows, each one worse than the last. She was 24 years old, had been married for 6 years, and now stood on an auction block like a piece of furniture or a farm animal. The crowd grew larger by the minute. She recognized faces from church, from the market, from school where she had taught children their letters before marriage. Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop wouldn't meet her eyes. Mr. Jenkins from the bank counted coins in his leather pouch. Even young Sally Morrison giggled with her friends, pointing and whispering. But at the back of the crowd, someone stood perfectly still. A tall man in a brown coat that had seen better days, his hat pulled low over his face. Something about the way he didn't move, didn't fidget like the others, made Clara's heart beat faster. Who was he? Why wasn't he talking or laughing like everyone else? "The bidding will begin shortly," Crane announced, pulling out his gold pocket watch. "But first, let me tell you about what you're purchasing today." Clara wanted to disappear, to sink into the wooden planks and never be seen again. Instead, she forced herself to stand taller. Her mother had always told her that dignity was something no one could take away unless you let them. Today, Clara would hold onto her dignity with both hands. "Clara Whitmore is 24 years old," Crane read from a piece of paper. "Healthy, strong, and carrying her first child. She can read, write, and cook. She knows how to tend a garden, mend clothes, and keep house. Any man who wins her will get a ready-made family and a wife who knows her duties." Each word made Clara feel smaller and smaller. They were talking about her like she was a horse for sale, listing her good points for buyers to consider. The baby inside her kicked as if it knew something terrible was happening. The silent man at the back of the crowd shifted slightly. Clara couldn't see his face under his hat, but she felt his attention like warmth from a fire. Was he planning to bid on her too? The thought made her stomach turn, but also filled her with strange curiosity. Who was he and what did he want? "Now then," Crane called out, raising his wooden hammer. "Before we begin, are there any questions about the merchandise?" A rough voice called out from the crowd. "What about the baby? Boy or girl?" "Won't know until it arrives," Crane replied. "But either way, you get extra value. A son to help with work or a daughter to marry off when she's grown." Clara's hands moved to protect her belly. They were talking about her unborn child like it was livestock. The anger that rose in her chest surprised her with its heat. She had been scared, but now she was mad too. The mysterious man in the back stepped forward, just one step, but enough that Clara could see him better. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and hands that looked strong from hard work. His boots were worn but well cared for, and his coat was patched but clean. A working man, not wealthy but not poor either. Why was he here? What did he want with a pregnant widow he'd never met? The questions burned in Clara's mind as Crane raised his hammer higher. In moments, the bidding would begin, and her fate would be decided by whoever had the most money and the loudest voice. But something about the silent stranger made her think that maybe, just maybe, this day might end differently than she feared. Let the bidding begin at $25. Crane's voice boomed across the square like thunder before a storm. Clara's heart hammered against her chest as she watched hands shoot up around the crowd. $25. That's what someone thought she was worth. Less than a good horse, less than a milk cow, less than the piano in the church hall. I hear 25 from Mr. Peterson. Crane pointed to a thin man near the front. Do I hear 30? Another hand went up. Then another. Clara watched the faces of men she had known her whole life as they decided how much money she was worth to them. Some looked excited, like they were bidding on a prize pig at the county fair. Others seemed bored, like buying a woman was just another Tuesday morning task. The baby kicked again, harder this time. Clara pressed her hand to her side and whispered, "It's going to be okay, little one." But she wasn't sure she believed her own words. $35, called out Jake Morrison, a rancher from the west side of town. Clara knew his reputation. His first wife had died in childbirth. His second wife had died from a fall down the stairs. His third wife had simply disappeared one winter day, and nobody asked too many questions. The thought of living with Jake Morrison made Clara's skin crawl like ants were marching up and down her arms. She looked around desperately, hoping someone else would bid higher. Someone kinder. Someone who might treat her like a person instead of property. $40 from Mr. Henderson. Crane's voice was getting more excited as the price climbed. More money meant more commission for him. Clara spotted Mrs. Henderson in the crowd, her face red with anger. She was glaring at her husband like she wanted to box his ears right there in public. At least someone else thought this whole thing was wrong. The mysterious man in the back hadn't moved. He stood like a statue, watching everything but saying nothing. Clara wondered what he was thinking. Was he planning to bid? Did he have enough money? And why did she care so much about what a stranger might do? $50. Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty knife. He was grinning now, showing teeth that were more yellow than white. $50 for the widow and her baby. Several other bidders dropped out. $50 was more money than most men saw in 2 months of hard work. Clara felt hope draining out of her like water from a broken bucket. Morrison was rich enough to outbid almost anyone in town. But then a new voice spoke up. $60. It was calm and quiet, but somehow everyone heard it clearly. Clara looked around, trying to see who had spoken. Near the middle of the crowd, a young man with red hair was holding up his hand. Danny O'Brien from the blacksmith shop. He was barely 20 years old, with kind eyes and gentle hands perfect for shoeing horses. $65. Morrison shouted, his face getting redder by the minute. He didn't like being challenged, especially by someone young enough to be his son. $70, Danny replied, his voice shaking just a little. Clara could see sweat on his forehead even though the morning was cool. The crowd was getting louder now. People loved a good fight, even when it was being fought with money instead of fists. Women whispered behind their hands. Men placed side bets on who would win. Children pushed closer to get a better view. Clara found herself silently cheering for Danny. He was young and poor, but he was also kind. She had seen him help old Mrs. Fletcher with her heavy packages, and he always tipped his hat politely when he passed ladies on the street. Life with Danny might not be easy, but at least it would be safe. $80. Morrison's voice was getting louder and angrier. He was used to getting what he wanted, and losing to a blacksmith's apprentice was making him furious. Danny hesitated. Clara could see him counting coins in his head, trying to figure out if he had enough money to keep bidding. His shoulders slumped slightly and Clara's heart sank. Danny was reaching his limit. $85, Danny said, but his voice was quieter now. Less sure. Morrison smiled like a cat who had cornered a mouse. $100, he announced, spreading his arms wide like he was putting on a show. $100 cash money, right here and now. The crowd gasped. $100 was more than most people in town made in a whole year. It was enough money to buy a small farm, or a team of horses, or a fancy carriage from back east. Danny's face went pale. He looked at Clara with sad eyes, then slowly lowered his hand. He was out of the bidding. Clara felt tears sting her eyes as her last hope for a decent life slipped away. Going once. Crane called out, his hammer raised high. $100 going once. Clara closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for life as Mrs. Jake Morrison. She thought about his previous wives, all dead before their time. She thought about her baby growing up in a house where love was scarce and fear was common. Going twice. Crane's voice seemed to come from far away, like she was hearing it through deep water. Just as Clara was about to give up completely, she heard something that made her heart stop. Footsteps. Heavy boots walking across the wooden planks of the platform. Someone was climbing up onto the auction block. She opened her eyes and gasped. The mysterious man in the worn brown coat was standing right beside her, so close she could smell leather and soap and something clean like fresh air. Up close, she could see that his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and serious and deep. He turned to face the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but somehow everyone could hear every word perfectly. $500. The square went completely silent. Even the horses stopped snorting. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. $500 was more money than anyone in town had ever seen in one place at one time. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was what the mysterious man said next, looking directly at Clara with those storm-gray eyes. On one condition, he said. The lady gets to choose. A gunshot rang out 3 blocks away, making everyone in the town square jump except for one man who didn't even blink. James McKenna had come to Millfield that morning looking for nothing more than rope and coffee beans. His horse needed new shoes and his pantry needed filling before winter set in. Simple needs for a simple life on his ranch 20 miles north of town. But now he stood frozen at the back of the crowd, staring at something that made his chest feel like someone had kicked him hard. The pregnant woman on the wooden platform reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. Not in looks. Sarah had been blonde where this woman was dark-haired, short where she was tall. But something about the way she held her shoulders straight and proud even when the whole world seemed against her brought back memories he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. $65, shouted a man near the front. James couldn't see the bidder's face, but he could hear the hunger in the voice. It made his stomach turn. James had been quiet his whole life. Even as a boy in Missouri, he'd been the one who listened while others talked. His pa used to say he had more sense in his little finger than most men had in their whole heads, precisely because he knew when to keep his mouth shut. But watching this woman, this Clara Whitmore, the auctioneer had called her, stand there like a prize cow at market made something hot and angry rise in his throat. The crowd pressed closer to the platform. Women in their Sunday dresses whispered behind gloved hands. Men in work clothes and business suits studied Clara like they were buying a horse. Some looked ashamed but stayed anyway. Others seemed to enjoy the show. James noticed old Mrs. Peterson from the general store shaking her head sadly, but she didn't leave either. Nobody left. That's when James started really paying attention to who was doing the bidding. Buck Morrison stood near the front, his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, rocking back and forth on his heels like he already owned the place. James knew Morrison by reputation, 3 dead wives, all young, all buried after difficult births. The man collected wives like some people collected horses, and he was just as careless with both. Behind Morrison, a thin man in an expensive suit kept raising his hand. James didn't recognize him, but his clothes said he had money and his eyes said he saw Clara as nothing more than property. The kind of man who'd buy a woman the same way he'd buy furniture for his house. Near the side of the crowd, a group of younger men were making jokes James couldn't quite hear, but their laughter made him want to punch something. They treated the whole thing like entertainment, like Clara's life was a story being told for their amusement. James felt his hands curl into fists inside his leather gloves. Back in Missouri, he'd seen men sold this way during the worst days after the war. He'd sworn then he'd never stand by and watch such a thing happen again. But here he was, standing silent while a pregnant woman got auctioned off like cattle. The autumn wind picked up, sending dust devils spinning across the square. Clara's dark hair whipped around her face and she raised one hand to push it back. That's when James saw it, the small, protective way she curved her other hand over her belly. She wasn't just thinking about herself. She was thinking about her baby, wondering what kind of world it would be born into. $70. Morrison's voice boomed across the square. James watched Clara's face go pale. She'd heard the stories about Morrison too then. Probably knew exactly what her life would be like if he won the bidding. James had seen Morrison's horses, well-fed but skittish, like they'd been broken hard and often. He treated his wives the same way. The thin man in the expensive suit raised his hand again. 75. James found himself studying every face in the crowd, memorizing them. These were the people who would let a pregnant woman be sold like property. These were the neighbors who would go home tonight and eat dinner with their families, telling themselves they'd done nothing wrong because they hadn't placed a bid themselves. But standing silent while evil happened was still a choice. James had learned that lesson the hard way in Missouri, and he carried the guilt of it like a stone in his chest. $80. Morrison called out, his voice full of confidence now. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, and James saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer. When she opened them again, she looked straight out over the crowd, and for just a second, her gaze met his. In that moment, James saw something that reminded him so much of Sarah it nearly took his breath away. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of fierce determination to protect what mattered most, even when everything else was falling apart. Sarah had looked at him the same way the night she died trying to birth their son. Both of them gone by morning, leaving James with nothing but an empty house and a silence so deep it sometimes threatened to swallow him whole. He'd failed Sarah because he'd been young and poor and powerless. But he wasn't any of those things anymore. 5 years of hard work had given him land, cattle, and enough money saved up to live comfortably. More importantly, 5 years of living alone had taught him that some things mattered more than comfort or safety or keeping quiet. James pulled his hat down lower over his eyes and started pushing through the crowd toward the front. People moved aside for him without thinking about it. He was tall enough and broad enough that most folks just naturally got out of his way. But as he walked, he could feel his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. 85, the thin man called out. James reached the front of the crowd just as Morrison opened his mouth to bid again. The rancher's face was red with excitement and something uglier that James didn't want to name. In that moment, James made a decision that would change everything. He'd been silent long enough. Clara's hands shook so badly she had to press them flat against her skirt to hide the trembling. $90. The bidding had reached $90 and she still stood on this wooden platform like a piece of furniture being sold at a estate sale. The morning sun felt too bright on her face, making everything seem harsh and unreal. She could smell the dust kicked up by restless horses tied to hitching posts around the square, mixed with the sweet scent of bread baking at Miller's shop across the street. Normal smells from a normal day, except nothing about this day was normal. Her baby moved inside her belly, a gentle flutter that reminded her why she had to stay strong. This little one didn't ask to be born into such a mess. Didn't deserve to grow up knowing its mama had been sold off like a cow at market. But what choice did she have? Thomas had left her with nothing but debts and shame, and the law said those debts had to be paid somehow. 95. Buck Morrison's voice rang out across the square, full of satisfaction that made Clara's skin crawl. She'd known Buck Morrison since she was a little girl. He'd been middle-aged even then, always looking at the young women in town with eyes that made them uncomfortable. His first wife, Mary, had been Clara's age when she married him. Sweet Mary, who used to bring cookies to church socials and always had a kind word for everyone. She died in childbirth 2 years later, looking tired and scared and much older than her 20 years. Then came Elizabeth, barely 18 and fresh from back east. She'd lasted 3 years before dying the same way. After that, Morrison had married Ruth, who was only 17 and had nowhere else to go after her parents died. Ruth made it to 21 before the same fate claimed her. Now Morrison wanted Clara and her unborn baby too. The thought made her feel sick to her stomach. Clara tried to focus on something else, anything else. She looked out over the crowd and tried to count familiar faces. There was Mrs. Henderson from the dress shop, looking uncomfortable but not leaving. Mr. Jameson from the bank, studying his pocket watch like he had important business elsewhere but making no move to go. The minister's wife, clutching her prayer book and whispering what might have been prayers or might have been gossip to the woman beside her. All these people she'd known her whole life, and not one of them had spoken up to say this was wrong. Not one had offered to help her find another way to pay Thomas's debts. They were treating this like a show, something to talk about over dinner tonight. $100. Morrison called out and Clara felt her knees nearly give way. $100. More money than she'd ever seen at one time in her whole life. More than Thomas had ever made in his best month at the mill. Enough to pay off his gambling debts and leave money for the town's expenses besides. She was worth $100 to a man who collected wives like prizes and buried them like mistakes. The thin man in the expensive suit had stopped bidding. He'd reached his limit, apparently, or decided Clara wasn't worth fighting Morrison over. Either way, it looked like Buck Morrison was about to become her new owner. The word made her mouth taste like copper pennies. Clara's hand moved to the small cameo brooch pinned to her dress, the only thing of value she'd managed to hide from the debt collectors. It had belonged to her mother and her grandmother before that. 3 generations of women who'd faced their own impossible choices with whatever dignity they could manage. What would her mama think if she could see this? Mama had always said a woman's worth wasn't measured by what men thought of her, but by what she thought of herself. Easy words to remember, harder words to live by when you were standing on an auction block with your baby's future hanging in the balance. Going once for $100. Silas Crane, the auctioneer, raised his wooden hammer high above his head. Clara closed her eyes and tried to picture her baby's face. Would it look like Thomas, with his brown eyes and quick smile? Or would it favor her side of the family with the stubborn chin that had gotten her in trouble more than once as a child? Either way, this baby would grow up knowing its mother had been sold to pay its father's debts. How could she ever explain that? The crowd had gone quiet now, sensing the end of the show. Clara could hear individual sounds, a horse snorting somewhere behind her, a woman's nervous cough, the creak of wagon wheels on the street. Normal sounds from a normal day that felt anything but normal. She opened her eyes and looked down at Morrison, who was already counting coins in his pocket like he owned her. His small, mean eyes were bright with satisfaction, and she could see him thinking about what he'd do with his new purchase. The thought made her stomach turn, but there was nowhere to run. Even if she could climb down from this platform and push through the crowd, where would she go? She had no money, no family, no friends willing to help her. Going twice. Crane's voice echoed across the square. That's when Clara noticed the tall man at the back of the crowd. He'd been there the whole time, she realized, but something about him had changed. He was moving forward now, pushing through the people like he had somewhere important to be. She couldn't see his face clearly under his hat brim, but something about the way he carried himself made her pay attention. Most men in the crowd were watching her like she was a prize to be won. But this stranger seemed to be watching the other men like he was sizing them up for a fight. His hands hung loose at his sides, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to take care of himself. Clara found herself holding her breath, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was just that he looked different from the others, quieter, more serious, like he understood that this wasn't entertainment but someone's entire life hanging in the balance. The man reached the front of the crowd just as Crane opened his mouth to call the sale final. And that's when everything changed. Morrison was already reaching for his money, already thinking about his new property, when the stranger's voice cut through the morning air like a knife through butter. 2 words that would change everything, spoken loud enough for the whole town to hear. But Clara would have to wait to learn what those words were, because her world was about to turn upside down in ways she never could have imagined. Clara's stomach twisted like a snake as Morrison's voice boomed across the town square. The wooden platform beneath her feet felt like it might crack under the weight of her fear. Sweat dripped down her back even though the October morning air was crisp and cold. $100. Morrison shouted again, waving his hat in the air like he just won a prize at the county fair. The crowd around the auction block buzzed with excitement. Women whispered behind their fans while men nodded their approval. $100 was more money than most folks in town saw in 6 months. Clara's hands shook as she gripped the edge of her worn shawl. From where she stood, Clara could see Morrison's yellow teeth when he smiled. She remembered the stories the other women told about his wives. Sarah Morrison had died just 2 winters ago, found frozen in the barn after Morrison claimed she'd gone to check on a sick calf. Before Sarah, there was Mary, who fell down the stairs and broke her neck. And before Mary, there was Ruth, who died giving birth to a baby that didn't live to see its first sunrise. Mrs. Whitmore will make an excellent addition to any household, Auctioneer Crane called out, his voice carrying across the square like a preacher on Sunday morning. Young, strong, and already carrying a child. Why, she's practically 2 for the price of 1. Clara felt her cheeks burn with shame. The baby inside her kicked as if it could sense her distress. She placed her hand over her belly and whispered a silent prayer for forgiveness. This wasn't the world she'd wanted to bring a child into. The banker's wife, Mrs. Henderson, stood near the front of the crowd. Clara had known her since childhood, had played with her daughters, had borrowed sugar from her kitchen just last month. But now Mrs. Henderson looked at Clara like she was a stranger, her nose wrinkled as if she smelled something unpleasant. Going once. Crane's voice cut through Clara's thoughts like a knife through butter. Clara's legs felt weak. She tried to imagine what her life would be like as Morrison's wife. She'd cook his meals, clean his house, tend his animals, and hope she lived long enough to see her baby grow up. The thought made her sick to her stomach. A group of teenage boys had gathered near the general store, pointing and laughing. One of them, Jimmy Patterson, had been sweet on Clara when they were children. Now he watched her like she was entertainment at a traveling show. "Look at her," one of the boys snickered. "Standing up there like she's something special. Won't be so proud when Morrison gets hold of her," another one added. Clara bit her lip so hard she tasted blood. She wanted to scream at them to tell them she was still a person with feelings and dreams. But her voice had disappeared somewhere between the morning she'd woken up a widow and the moment she'd stepped onto this platform. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the square. Clara's dress flapped around her legs and she had to hold down her skirt to keep it from flying up. Even the weather seemed determined to strip away what little dignity she had left. Morrison stepped closer to the platform, close enough that Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the dirt under his fingernails. His eyes traveled up and down her body like he was inspecting a horse he might buy. "Don't you worry, little lady," Morrison called up to her, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll take real good care of you and that baby. Got a nice warm bed and 3 good meals a day waiting." The crowd chuckled at his words, but Clara heard the threat beneath them. She'd seen the bruises on Sarah Morrison's arms when she came to church. She'd heard Mary Morrison crying through the thin walls of their house when she walked past on her way to the market. "Going twice," Crane announced, raising his wooden gavel high in the air. Clara closed her eyes and tried to picture her mother's face. Mama had been strong, stronger than anyone Clara had ever known. She'd raised 5 children after Papa died in a mining accident, had kept food on the table and clothes on their backs by taking in washing and mending. "What would you do, Mama?" Clara whispered to herself. But the only answer was the sound of Crane clearing his throat, preparing to bring his gavel down and seal her fate forever. The crowd held its breath. Even the horses tied to the hitching posts seemed to sense the importance of the moment. Clara opened her eyes and looked out over the sea of faces, searching for even one person who might speak up for her. That's when she noticed him. A tall figure in a dark coat had moved from the back of the crowd to stand directly below the auction platform. Clara hadn't seen him before, but something about the way he stood made her heart skip a beat. While everyone else leaned forward eagerly, he remained perfectly still, like a tree that had grown roots deep into the earth. James McKenna had been in town for less than an hour, but he'd already seen enough to make his blood boil. He'd come to buy supplies for his ranch, maybe have a drink at the saloon, and head home before dark. He hadn't planned on watching a pregnant woman get sold like cattle in the town square. The woman on the platform looked young, maybe 25 at most. Her brown hair was pinned back neatly, but loose strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore a simple blue dress that had been mended in several places, and she clutched a small brooch at her throat like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. James had seen that look before, during the war. It was the expression soldiers wore right before a battle they knew they couldn't win. Desperate but trying to be brave. Scared but refusing to give up. The auctioneer's gavel hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Morrison stood below the platform, rubbing his hands together like he was already planning what he'd do with his purchase. The crowd waited, hungry for the drama to reach its peak. James thought about his own mother, who died when he was 12. She'd always told him that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who couldn't defend themselves. "The strong protect the weak, Jimmy," she'd whispered on her deathbed. "That's what separates good folks from bad ones." He carried those words with him through battles and blizzards, through lonely nights on the trail and dangerous days in rough towns. But he'd never felt them as strongly as he did right now, watching this young woman face a fate worse than death. Morrison's bit hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. $100 for a human being. James had spent more than that on a good horse, and horses couldn't think or feel or dream about the future. The woman's hand moved to her belly, protective and gentle. James wondered how old the baby was, whether it would be born before winter set in, whether it would ever know its father. He thought about the children he might have had if things had been different, if the war hadn't changed him, if he'd found the right woman to share his life with. "Going twice," the auctioneer called out. Time seemed to slow down like honey dripping from a spoon. James watched the woman's face crumple with despair. He saw Morrison lick his lips in anticipation. He heard the crowd murmur with excitement. And then something inside him snapped like a branch in a windstorm. James had never been much of a talker. He preferred to listen, to watch, to think before he acted. But sometimes thinking wasn't enough. Sometimes a man had to step forward and do what was right, even if it cost him everything he had. The leather pouch in his coat pocket contained his life savings, money he'd been saving to buy more land, to expand his ranch, to build the future he'd been dreaming about for years. But what good was a future built on watching others suffer? He stepped forward, his boots loud on the wooden boardwalk. The crowd parted in front of him like water around a rock. People turned to stare at the stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere, tall and serious and moving with purpose. The woman on the platform looked down at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, their gazes met and held. James saw fear there, yes, but also hope, fragile as a bird's egg, but real. Morrison turned around, annoyed by the disturbance. "What's going on?" he demanded. "I won the bid fair and square." But James wasn't looking at Morrison. He was looking at the auctioneer, calculating odds and possibilities and consequences. He was thinking about his mother's words, about the money in his pocket, about the difference between existing and living. The gavel started to fall, moving through the air toward the wooden block that would seal the woman's fate forever. That's when James McKenna opened his mouth and spoke the words that would change everything. $500. His voice rang out clear and strong, cutting through the morning air like a church bell calling people to worship. The gavel froze halfway to its target. Morrison's mouth fell open. The crowd went silent as a graveyard at midnight. On the platform, the woman swayed on her feet, her face pale as fresh snow. $500 was more money than she'd ever imagined, more than most people in town would see in 5 years. James reached into his coat and pulled out the leather pouch, holding it up for everyone to see. The coins inside clinked together like music, like freedom, like possibility made real. $500, he repeated, his voice steady as stone. Cash money, right here, right now. The auctioneer blinked like he'd been struck by lightning. Morrison's face turned red as the sun set. The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps and excited chatter. But James only had eyes for the woman on the platform, the woman whose life he'd just bought with his dreams. The whole town square went dead quiet when James spoke those words. $500. Clara's heart nearly stopped beating. She looked down at this strange cowboy who had just offered more money than most people saw in 3 years. The crowd around them started whispering like angry bees. "Did he really say 500? Whispered Mrs. Henderson to her neighbor. "That's more than my husband makes all year," another woman gasped. But James McKenna stood there calm as still water. His hand rested easy on the leather bag full of silver coins. Clara could see he wasn't bluffing. This wasn't some game to him. But why would a complete stranger do this? Morrison's face turned red as a beet. "Now wait just a minute," he shouted. "You can't just come in here and The man made a fair bid, Crane interrupted. The auctioneer's eyes were shining like Christmas morning. He was already counting his share of such a huge sale. Clara gripped the cameo brooch so tight it hurt her palm. 3 minutes ago, she thought her life was over. Now this mysterious cowboy was offering her something she never dreamed possible. But what did he want in return? The crowd pressed closer. Everyone wanted to hear what would happen next. "Sir," Crane called down to James, "you said you had a condition. What might that be?" James pushed his hat back a little. Clara could see his eyes now. They were blue like winter sky, but kind. Not hungry like Morrison's eyes. Not cruel like some of the other men staring at her. "The condition is simple," James said. His voice carried across the square so everyone could hear. "Mrs. Whitmore gets to choose." The crowd buzzed louder. This was unheard of. Women didn't get choices at debt auctions. They were property, same as horses or land. "Choose what exactly?" Morrison demanded. He looked ready to explode. James never took his eyes off Clara. "She can come with me, free and clear. No debt. No strings attached. Or she can say no and I'll walk away. Either way, I pay the debt." Clara felt dizzy. "You would pay all that money and just leave? If I said no?" "Yes, ma'am. Your life should be your choice to make." Old Mrs. Patterson gasped. "Well, I never heard such nonsense in all my days." But young Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, stepped forward. "I think it's wonderful," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Every woman should have choices." Morrison spat in the dirt. "This is crazy talk. You buy a woman, you own a woman. That's how it's always been." "Maybe that's the problem," James said quietly. The wind picked up, blowing dust across the square. Clara felt the baby move inside her belly. What kind of world was she bringing this child into? One where people were bought and sold like cattle? Or one where strangers offered freedom with no price attached? Sheriff Bradley stepped closer. "Mr. McKenna, this is highly unusual." Are you sure you understand what you're proposing? I understand perfectly, Sheriff. I'm proposing that Mrs. Whitmore is a human being with the right to choose her own path. Clara looked around at all the faces staring up at her. Some looked shocked. Some looked angry. But a few looked hopeful, like maybe they wanted to believe in a world where such choices were possible. What would happen to me? Clara asked. If I came with you, I mean. James considered this carefully. I have a small ranch about 20 miles north. Good house, strong walls. You could stay there as long as you needed. Help with cooking if you wanted, but you wouldn't have to. When you felt ready to move on, I'd help you get wherever you wanted to go. And you would expect nothing from me? Nothing you didn't freely choose to give. Morrison threw his hat on the ground. This is the biggest load of horse manure I ever heard. No man spends that kind of money for nothing. Maybe you're right, James said. Maybe I do want something. Clara's heart sank. Here it comes, she thought. Here's the real price. What? She whispered. James smiled for the first time since he'd spoken up. I want to live in a world where pregnant widows don't get sold like livestock. I want to live in a world where people help each other without keeping score. If paying your debt helps make that world exist, then it's money well spent. The square fell silent again. Even the children stopped running around to listen. But was he telling the truth? Could Clara trust this strange cowboy who appeared out of nowhere like something from a fairy tale? And even if she could trust him, did she have the courage to choose freedom when she'd spent her whole life being told what to do? Clara's hands shook as she stood on that wooden platform. Every person in town was staring at her, waiting to see what she would do. The weight of their stares felt heavier than the baby growing inside her. She had never made a choice this big in her entire life. She started, then stopped. Her voice came out like a squeaky mouse. Take your time, ma'am, James said gently. No rush at all. But Morrison was getting impatient. Come on. Make up your mind. I got things to do today. Clara closed her eyes and tried to think. What would her mother have done? Mama had been strong and brave. She had faced hard times and never gave up. The cameo brooch felt warm in Clara's hand, like her mother was right there with her. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Morrison first. His mean little eyes reminded her of a rat looking at cheese. She knew exactly what her life would be like with him. She had heard the stories about his other wives. Hard work from sunrise to sunset. Beatings when supper wasn't ready on time. And babies born too early because of too much worry and too little food. Then she looked at James McKenna. He stood patient as a mountain, waiting for her answer. His clothes were old but clean. His boots were worn but well cared for. Everything about him said he was a man who kept his word. But could she really trust him? Men always wanted something, even when they pretended they didn't. Mr. McKenna, she said, her voice getting stronger. Why are you really doing this? Some folks in the crowd nodded. They wanted to know too. James thought for a moment. My sister died 3 years ago, he said quietly. Her husband sold her to pay his drinking debts. She died in childbirth, far from home, with strangers who didn't care if she lived or died. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. Now she understood. I couldn't save her, James continued. But maybe I can save you. Maybe that's worth $500 to me. Morrison snorted. Sentimental fool. Woman's gonna take your money and run off anyway. Then that's her right, James said firmly. Clara looked out over the crowd again. She saw Mrs. Patterson shaking her head like this was all wrong. She saw the banker counting money in his head. She saw young mothers holding their children close, maybe thinking about their own futures. And she saw Sarah Miller, the schoolteacher, giving her an encouraging nod. What about the baby? Clara asked. Your sister's baby, I mean. Died with her, James said sadly. Never got a chance at life. Clara put both hands on her belly. Her baby kicked right then, like it was trying to tell her something. This little person deserved a chance at a good life. A life where it wouldn't be bought and sold like a pig at market. Mr. Morrison, Clara said, turning to face the angry rancher. I've heard stories about your wives. What stories? Morrison's face got even redder. Stories about bruises. Stories about empty supper plates. Stories about women who died too young. Now you listen here. No, you listen, Clara said, surprising herself with how strong her voice sounded. I won't bring my child into a house where women are treated like animals. The crowd started murmuring. Some people looked shocked that Clara was speaking up to Morrison. Others looked pleased, like they had been waiting for someone to say these things out loud. Clara turned back to James. And you, Mr. McKenna. You promise you won't expect me to be your wife. I promise. You promise I can leave whenever I want? I promise. You promise my baby and I will be safe? On my honor. Clara took a deep breath. The autumn air filled her lungs and seemed to give her courage she didn't know she had. Then I accept your offer, she said clearly. The crowd exploded in chatter. Some people clapped. Others shook their heads. Morrison cursed and stomped away, kicking dirt as he went. James stepped up to the platform and offered Clara his hand. Thank you for trusting me, Mrs. Whitmore. As Clara took his hand and stepped down from the auction block, she felt like she was stepping into a completely new life. For the first time in months, maybe years, she had chosen something for herself. The baby kicked again, and Clara smiled. I think the baby approves, she told James. Smart baby, James replied with a grin. As they walked away from the square together, Clara realized something amazing. She wasn't anybody's property anymore. She wasn't a burden or a debt to be paid. She was just Clara, a woman with choices to make and a life to live. And for the first time since Thomas died, that felt like enough. The coins made a loud ringing sound as they hit the wooden table in front of Silas Crane. Clara's heart jumped like a scared rabbit when she realized what had just happened. She was free. Actually free. No more being sold like a cow at market. But freedom felt strange and scary, like stepping into a dark room without knowing what was hiding in the corners. James McKenna tucked the paper that said her debt was paid into his coat pocket. The paper crinkled like dry leaves. Around them, people started walking away, talking in whispers about what they had just seen. Clara heard words floating in the air, strange, never seen anything like it, that cowboy must be crazy. Where will we go? Clara asked, her voice so quiet it almost got lost in the wind. The autumn air was getting colder. Dark clouds were moving across the sky like giant gray blankets. Clara could smell rain coming. It reminded her of the day Thomas died, when the storm had seemed to wash away everything she thought she knew about her life. That depends on where you want to go, ma'am, James said. He tipped his hat like she was a fancy lady instead of someone who had just been sold like property. I've got a small ranch about 20 miles north of here. Nothing special, but it's got a good roof and strong walls. You can stay as long as you need to figure out what comes next. Clara looked at his face, trying to find the trap. Every man she had ever known wanted something from her. Her father had wanted her to marry well. Thomas had wanted her to look pretty and keep quiet. The men bidding today had wanted her to work hard and give them children. But when she looked into James McKenna's eyes, she saw something different. Something that made her think of clear water in a mountain stream. What do you want from me? She asked straight out. James was quiet for a moment. A horse snickered somewhere behind them. A dog barked. Normal sounds of a normal day, even though nothing about this day felt normal. Nothing you don't want to give, he said finally. I know what it's like to have people decide what your life should be. I won't do that to you. Clara's hand went to the cameo brooch she had hidden in her dress. Her mother had worn this same brooch on her wedding day. Her mother had also told her stories about making hard choices when life got difficult. Sometimes her mother had said the scariest door is the one that leads to the best room in the house. Before Clara could answer James, she heard heavy footsteps behind them. She turned around and saw Sheriff Bradley walking toward them. His face looked like he had eaten something sour. Behind him came Buck Morrison, and Clara's stomach dropped like a stone falling into a deep well. Now hold on just a minute, the sheriff called out. Clara felt James move slightly, putting himself between her and the sheriff. It was such a small movement that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Clara noticed everything now. Every sound, every smell, every tiny change in the air around her. What's the problem, Sheriff? James asked. His voice stayed calm, but Clara could hear something underneath it. Like thunder that was still far away but getting closer. Sheriff Bradley stopped in front of them. His hand rested on his gun, though he didn't take it out. Mr. Morrison here says there might be a problem with this whole business. Morrison stepped forward. His face was red and sweaty even though the air was getting cooler. He looked at Clara like she was a piece of pie he wanted to eat. That's right, Sheriff. I got papers that say Thomas Whitmore owed me money before he died. If that's true, then his widow belongs to me before anyone else can make a claim. Clara felt like someone had dumped ice water over her head. She had thought it was over. She had thought she was free. But now it seemed like her nightmare was starting all over again. What kind of papers? James asked. Morrison pulled out some folded papers from his vest pocket. They looked wrinkled and old. IOUs signed by Thomas Whitmore himself. Dated 2 weeks before he died. $150 to be paid in cash or other ways. Clara's mind raced. Thomas had told her about his gambling debts, but he had never mentioned owing money to Morrison specifically. Morrison was known around town for being mean to his wives. 3 wives, and all 3 were buried in the churchyard. People whispered that Morrison worked his wives too hard and didn't care enough when they got sick. The thought of going to Morrison's house made Clara feel sick. She thought about her baby growing inside her. What kind of life would her child have with a man like Morrison? "Let me see those papers," Sheriff Bradley said. Morrison handed them over with a big smile. He looked like a cat that had caught a mouse. Clara watched the sheriff read the papers, her heart beating so fast she thought it might jump right out of her chest. The wind picked up, making the papers flutter in the sheriff's hands. Dust swirled around their feet. In the distance, Clara could hear thunder rumbling like an angry giant. "These look real enough," Sheriff Bradley said slowly. "If Mr. Morrison's claim came before the auction, then we need to sort this out the right way." Clara felt her knees get weak. Just when she thought she was free, the trap was closing around her again. But this time, the trap had sharp teeth and mean eyes. James looked at the papers, then at Clara's pale face. Something changed in his expression. The quiet cowboy was still there, but underneath she could see something harder. Something that had learned to fight when fighting was necessary. "How much?" James asked Morrison. "What's that?" "How much for your claim?" "Cash money, right here, right now." Morrison's eyes got bright and greedy. "Well now, that's interesting. But the widow might be worth more to me than just money, if you know what I mean." The way Morrison looked at Clara made her feel dirty. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hide from his stare. Clara's hand tightened on the cameo brooch. Her mother had faced down hard men and difficult choices. Her mother had been strong when being strong seemed impossible. Maybe it was time for Clara to find that same strength. "Wait just 1 minute," Clara said, her voice cutting through the men's talk like a knife through butter. All 3 men stopped and stared at her. Morrison looked surprised that she had spoken at all. Sheriff Bradley frowned like he wasn't sure women were supposed to talk during business discussions. But James McKenna nodded slightly like he had been waiting for her to speak up. Clara took a deep breath. The wind was getting stronger now and she could feel raindrops starting to fall. But she didn't care about getting wet. She cared about the papers Morrison was waving around like a victory flag. "I want to see those papers," she said, holding out her hand. Morrison clutched the papers against his chest. "Now see here, woman. This is business between men." "Those papers have my husband's name on them," Clara said, her voice getting stronger. "That makes it my business too." Sheriff Bradley looked confused. In all his years of keeping the peace, he had never had a woman demand to see legal papers. Most women left that kind of thing to their husbands or fathers. But Thomas was dead and Clara didn't have a father anymore. "Give her the papers, Morrison," the sheriff said finally. Morrison's face turned even redder. But he couldn't argue with the sheriff, so he handed the papers to Clara with a mean look in his eyes. Clara took the papers carefully. Her hands were shaking a little, but she tried not to let it show. She had helped Thomas with his business writing for years. She knew how to read contracts and IOUs. She also knew how Thomas signed his name. The first thing she noticed was the ink. It looked too dark and fresh for papers that were supposed to be weeks old. The second thing she noticed was the handwriting. It looked like Thomas's writing, but something was wrong. "Thomas always signed his name fast," Clara said, studying the signature. "He made a big loop on the W in Whitmore. But this signature is too careful. Too slow." Morrison's face went white, then red, then white again. "You calling me a liar?" "I'm saying these papers are fake," Clara said clearly. "This isn't my husband's real signature." Sheriff Bradley stepped closer and looked at the papers again. This time he paid attention to details he had missed before. The ink did look fresh. The paper didn't have the yellow edges that old papers usually got. "Mr. Morrison," the sheriff said slowly, "these papers do look mighty new for something that's weeks old." Morrison started sweating more. His hands moved toward his gun, and Clara saw the exact moment when he decided to stop pretending and start threatening. "Don't matter what they look like," Morrison growled. "What matters is that the woman owes me money and I'm going to collect one way or another." Clara felt James move beside her. She couldn't see his face, but she could feel the change in him. It was like watching a sleeping wolf wake up when it smelled danger. "You threatening a lady, Morrison?" James asked. His voice was still quiet, but now it had an edge that could cut glass. "I'm collecting what's mine," Morrison shot back. His hand was definitely on his gun now. Clara's mind was racing. She had proof that Morrison's papers were fake, but Morrison looked like a man who might shoot someone rather than admit he was a cheater. And even if James could protect her from Morrison, what about next time? Would there always be another Buck Morrison trying to claim her? That's when Clara realized something important. She had been thinking like someone who needed to be protected. But maybe what she really needed was to protect herself. "Sheriff Bradley," Clara said, her voice carrying across the square, "I want to file a complaint against Mr. Morrison for trying to cheat me with fake papers." Everyone stared at her again. Women didn't file complaints. Women didn't accuse men of crimes. Women stayed quiet and let the men handle everything. But Clara wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. "Those papers are forgeries," she continued. "Mr. Morrison tried to use them to steal money and to force me into a marriage I don't want. That's against the law, isn't it?" Sheriff Bradley scratched his head. He had dealt with claim jumpers and cattle thieves and drunk cowboys, but he had never had a woman file a complaint against a man for forging documents. "Well," he said slowly, "fraud is against the law, yes ma'am." Morrison's face was now purple with rage. "You can't prove nothing, woman." "I can prove my husband's real signature," Clara said. "I have letters he wrote me. I have business papers with his real name on them. We can compare them to your fake papers and see which one is real." Morrison's hand dropped to his gun handle. Clara saw it happening and felt time slow down like thick honey. She thought about her baby and about James McKenna who had tried to help her and about her mother who had always said that sometimes you had to fight for what was right. But just as Morrison started to draw his gun, something unexpected happened. James McKenna's gun appeared in his hand like magic. Clara hadn't even seen him move, but suddenly his pistol was pointed right at Morrison's chest. "I wouldn't," James said quietly. Morrison froze with his gun only halfway out of its holster. Sheriff Bradley quickly drew his own weapon and pointed it at Morrison too. "Drop it, Morrison," the sheriff ordered. "Drop it right now." For a long moment, nobody moved. Clara could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She could smell the rain that was starting to fall harder. She could see the fear and anger fighting in Morrison's eyes. Finally, Morrison let his gun fall back into its holster. But the look he gave Clara was full of hate and promises of future trouble. "This isn't over," he muttered. "Yes, it is," Clara said firmly. "It's over because I say it's over." And for the first time in her life, Clara truly believed that she had the power to make her own decisions and defend them. A gunshot echoed from somewhere behind the crowd, making everyone jump and turn their heads. But it was just a rancher's boy scaring crows from the cornfield, though the sound made Morrison's hand twitch toward his belt like a snake ready to strike. James looked at the crumpled paper Morrison waved around like a battle flag. The writing was messy, like someone had tried to copy letters they'd seen before but weren't quite sure how to make them look right. Something didn't smell right about this whole situation, and James had learned to trust his nose when it came to trouble. "How much do you want for your claim?" James asked Morrison straight out. Morrison's little pig eyes got bright and greedy. "Well now, that's a complicated question, stranger. See, the widow here means more to me than just money." His gaze crawled over Clara like a spider across a web. "She's got special value, if you know what I mean." Clara felt sick to her stomach. The baby inside her seemed to kick harder, as if it could sense the danger too. She pressed her hand against her belly and tried to stay calm, but her heart was beating so fast she thought everyone could probably hear it. "Name your price in dollars," James said again. His voice was quiet, but something in it made the hair on Clara's arms stand up. She'd heard that tone before from her father when he was about to do something dangerous but necessary. Sheriff Bradley shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He looked like a man who wished he was anywhere else in the world right now. The crowd had gotten bigger instead of smaller, with people coming out of shops and houses to see what all the fuss was about. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was whispering behind her hand to the preacher's wife, and both women kept staring at Clara like she was some kind of strange animal in a traveling show. 500 more, Morrison said suddenly, his voice getting louder and more confident. "That's what she's worth to me. 1,000 total, and I'll tear up these here papers." The number hit Clara like a slap across the face. $1,000 was more money than most people in town would see in 5 years. It was enough to buy a good house, a wagon, 2 horses, and still have money left over for winter supplies. How could any person be worth that much money? But then she looked at James's face and saw something that surprised her. He wasn't looking at Morrison like the man was crazy for asking so much. He was looking at Morrison like he was trying to figure out the best way to solve a problem. "You got that kind of money on you, stranger?" Morrison asked with a nasty smile. "Because I don't take promises or IOUs. Cash only, just like it says on these papers." James reached into his coat and pulled out not one leather pouch, but 3. Each one clinked with the sound of silver coins, and Clara's eyes went wide. Who was this man? Cowboys didn't usually carry around enough money to buy a small farm. Even successful ranchers kept most of their money in banks, not in pouches tied to their belts. I might, James said carefully. But first, I want to see those papers up close. Real close. Morrison's confident expression flickered like a candle in the wind. What for? You calling me a liar? I'm calling you a man with papers that need looking at, James replied. If they're real, you get your money. If they're not. He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. The sheriff stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. Now see here, gentlemen. We're all civilized folks. No need for anyone to get heated up over this. But Clara could feel the heat rising anyway, like steam from a kettle about to boil over. Morrison's face was getting red and sweat was beating up on his forehead even though the autumn air was cool. James looked calm as still water, but Clara had seen enough angry men in her life to recognize the warning signs. There was something coiled tight inside him, ready to spring. Hand over the papers, James said. It wasn't a request. Morrison clutched the documents tighter to his chest. These are legal papers, signed and witnessed. I don't have to show them to nobody except the sheriff here. Then show them to the sheriff, Clara said suddenly, her own voice surprising her. All three men turned to look at her and she felt her cheeks burn hot. But she kept talking anyway. If they're real papers like you say, then Sheriff Bradley should be the one to look at them first. Sheriff Bradley nodded slowly. That's actually a good point, Mrs. Whitmore. Mr. Morrison, if you're claiming a legal debt, I should examine the documentation. Morrison's grip on the papers got even tighter. His knuckles turned white and Clara could see a vein pulsing in his temple. Well, that is to say. What's wrong, Morrison? James asked. His voice was still quiet, but there was steel underneath it now. Afraid of what the sheriff might find. The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama like wolves smell blood. Clara heard someone whisper, "What's in them papers?" and someone else answered, "Must be something worth hiding." Morrison looked around at all the faces staring at him, waiting for his answer. His little pig eyes darted from person to person like he was looking for an escape route but couldn't find one. The paper in his hands started to shake, just a little bit. "Course I ain't afraid," he said, but his voice cracked on the words. "These papers are legal as Sunday church. But I don't appreciate being questioned like some common criminal." "Then prove it," Clara said, and this time her voice was strong and clear. The baby inside her gave another kick and she took it as encouragement. Show everyone what kind of man makes deals with other people's lives. What Morrison did next would change everything, but nobody expected him to reach for his gun. Morrison's hand slammed down on his gun handle so fast that Clara's scream got caught in her throat like a fishbone. But James was faster. His own weapon appeared in his hand like magic, the metal barrel catching the gray light from the storm clouds overhead. "Don't even think about it," James said, his voice cutting through the sudden silence like a knife through butter. Every person in the square froze like they were playing a game of statues, afraid that moving might set off an explosion. Sheriff Bradley jumped between the two men, his own gun half drawn. "Put them down. Both of you, right now." But Clara wasn't looking at the guns. She was staring at Morrison's face, which had gone from red to white to green like a chameleon trying to hide. The papers in his other hand were shaking so hard now that she could hear them rattling like leaves in a strong wind. "Give me those papers, Morrison," Sheriff Bradley ordered. "Right now, before someone gets hurt." Morrison's eyes darted back and forth between James's steady gun and the sheriff's stern face. Sweat was dripping down his cheeks now, and Clara could smell his fear, sour and sharp like spoiled milk. The crowd had backed away, forming a wide circle around the three armed men, but nobody was leaving. This was the most exciting thing that had happened in town since the bank robbery 2 years ago. Morrison started, then stopped. His gun hand was trembling now too, and Clara realized he was scared. Really, truly scared. Men who were telling the truth didn't usually get scared when people asked to see their proof. "The papers, Morrison," the sheriff said again. "Now." With a curse that made the preacher's wife gasp and cover her ears, Morrison threw the documents at Sheriff Bradley's feet and stepped back, his gun finally sliding back into its holster. His face was twisted up like he'd been eating green apples, and Clara could see defeat written all over him. James kept his weapon trained on Morrison but nodded to Clara. "Pick them up, ma'am. You knew your husband's handwriting better than anyone." Clara's hands were shaking as she bent down to gather the scattered papers. The ink on them was dark and fresh-looking, not faded like documents that were weeks old should be. But it was the signature that made her heart skip a beat. Thomas had always signed his name in a hurry with a big loop on the T and a line under the whole thing that looked like a bird in flight. He'd done it the same way for 20 years, ever since they'd gotten married and she'd watched him sign their wedding certificate. But this signature was different. Careful. Neat. Like someone had practiced writing it over and over until they got it right, but still couldn't quite capture the natural flow of a man writing his own name. "These are fake," she said, her voice getting stronger with each word. "This isn't Thomas's real signature." Morrison snarled like a cornered animal. "You're lying. Course you'd say that. You don't want to pay what you owe." "I'm not lying," Clara shot back, surprising herself with how fierce she sounded. The baby inside her seemed to agree, giving her a strong kick that felt like encouragement. "I watched my husband sign his name 1,000 times. This isn't how he wrote." She held up the papers for everyone to see. "Look at the ink. It's too dark, too fresh. And the paper, it's not even wrinkled right. These were made yesterday, maybe today." Sheriff Bradley took the documents and studied them carefully. His frown got deeper with each second that passed. "Mrs. Whitmore's right. This ink is fresh as morning coffee. And the paper. Morrison, where exactly did you get these?" Morrison's face went through about 6 different expressions in the space of 3 seconds. That is, they were. Thomas gave them to me himself." "When?" Clara demanded. "Where?" "Thomas died 3 weeks ago, and I was with him every day before that because he was sick." "When exactly did he give you papers that look like they were written this morning?" The crowd started murmuring, and not in Morrison's favor. Clara heard someone say, "Always knew that man was no good," and someone else mutter, "Trying to cheat a pregnant widow. That's low, even for Morrison." Morrison looked around at all the angry faces and realized his scheme was falling apart like a house made of cards in a windstorm. His hand twitched toward his gun again, but James's weapon was still pointed right at his heart. "Easy there," James said softly. "You've got 2 choices, Morrison. You can ride out of town right now and never come back, or you can explain to the sheriff why you're trying to steal a woman's freedom with fake papers." "They ain't fake," Morrison shouted, but even he didn't sound like he believed it anymore. Clara stepped forward, holding the forged documents up for everyone to see. "You want to know how I really know these are fake? Because Thomas couldn't write this neat if his life depended on it. His hands shook too much from all his drinking. But whoever made these has steady hands and plenty of time to practice." She looked Morrison right in the eye. "You made these papers yourself, didn't you? Probably last night, after you heard about the auction. You figured nobody would check too close, and you'd get yourself a wife and a baby for the price of some ink and paper." Morrison's face crumpled like a paper sack. All the fight went out of him at once, and he suddenly looked like what he really was. A middle-aged man who'd tried to cheat his way to something he couldn't afford honestly. "All right," he yelled. "All right, I made them. But you can't blame a man for trying. She was just sitting there, ripe for the picking, and I thought." "You thought wrong," James said firmly. "Now get out of town before I decide to let the sheriff arrest you for attempted fraud." Morrison looked around one more time, but every face in the crowd was set against him now. Even his few friends were looking at him like he'd grown a second head. With a final curse, he stomped away toward his horse, muttering under his breath about unfair treatment and uppity women. As he rode out of town, Clara felt something change inside her chest. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, she'd stood up for herself. She'd used her brain and her knowledge and her voice to fight back against someone trying to hurt her. And she'd won. But the biggest surprise was still to come, because James McKenna was about to tell her something that would change everything she thought she knew about why he'd helped her. A gunshot cracked through the air like lightning splitting the sky. But the bullet wasn't meant for anyone. James had fired straight up into the storm clouds, his message clear as thunder. Every person in the town square froze like statues, their eyes wide with shock. Even Morrison's hand stopped halfway to his gun. "Nobody needs to die today," James said. his voice calm as morning coffee despite the chaos around him. "But somebody's gonna make a choice real quick." Clara felt her heart beating so fast it might burst right out of her chest. She'd never seen a real gunfight before, only heard stories from travelers passing through town. But here she stood, right in the middle of one, with her unborn baby depending on what happened next. Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, his own gun now pointing at Morrison. "Buck Morrison, you're under arrest for making fake papers and trying to cheat this woman. You can't prove nothing." Morrison snarled, but sweat was pouring down his face like he'd been working in the hot sun all day. That's when Clara remembered something that made her stomach flip. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a real note from Thomas that she'd found in his coat after he died. "Actually, Sheriff," Clara said, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it before, "I can prove everything." She held up Thomas's real handwriting next to Morrison's fake papers. Even from 6 feet away, anyone could see they looked as different as night and day. Thomas wrote with big, looping letters that slanted to the right. Morrison's fake papers had small, careful writing that stood straight up like tiny soldiers. The crowd pressed closer, murmuring and pointing. Mrs. Henderson from the general store gasped. "Why, that's clear as day. Those papers are fake as a $3 bill." Morrison's face turned red as a ripe tomato. "That don't matter none. The woman still owes money." "To who?" James asked, stepping closer. "You just proved you're a liar and a cheat. Why should anyone believe anything else you say?" But Morrison wasn't done fighting. Quick as a snake, he lunged toward Clara, grabbing her arm and yanking her toward him. "If I can't have her legal-like, I'll take her anyway," Clara cried out as Morrison's fingers dug into her arm. Fear shot through her like ice water, but then something else took over, something fierce and protective that came from deep inside her. She twisted hard and brought her knee up, catching Morrison right where it would hurt him most. Morrison doubled over with a howl that could be heard 3 blocks away. Clara broke free and stumbled backward, right into James's steady arms. "That's enough," Sheriff Bradley shouted, pointing his gun at Morrison. "Buck Morrison, you're under arrest for assault, fraud, and disturbing the peace." But Morrison wasn't finished causing trouble. As the sheriff moved to put handcuffs on him, Morrison suddenly pulled a hidden knife from his boot. The blade flashed silver in the dim light as he swung it toward the sheriff's back. James saw the danger first. Without thinking, he pushed Sheriff Bradley aside and caught Morrison's wrist, wrestling for control of the knife. The 2 men crashed to the ground, rolling in the dirt as they fought. Clara watched in horror as the knife blade swept dangerously close to James's throat. She looked around desperately for something to help with. That's when she spotted a heavy water bucket beside the auctioneer's platform. Acting on pure instinct, Clara grabbed the bucket and dumped the entire thing over Morrison's head. The ice-cold water shocked him so much that he let go of the knife and gasped like a fish out of water. James quickly pinned Morrison to the ground while Sheriff Bradley snapped the handcuffs on tight. "Thanks, Mrs. Whitmore," the sheriff panted. "You might have just saved my life." As they hauled Morrison to his feet, dripping wet and defeated, he glared at Clara with pure hatred. "This ain't over, woman. I got friends. They'll come looking for you." "Let them come," Clara said, surprising herself with how brave she sounded. "I'm not afraid anymore." And as she said those words, Clara realized they were true. For the first time in her whole life, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. But Morrison's threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Even with him in jail, Clara knew their troubles might not be over. Some fights end with handcuffs, but others are just beginning. As the crowd finally began to break up and go home, James turned to Clara with worry in his eyes. "You did real good back there," he said quietly. "But Morrison wasn't lying about having friends. We might need to leave town sooner than I planned." Clara nodded, her hand moving to protect her unborn child. "Where will we go?" "I know a place," James said, "but it's a hard journey, and winter's coming fast." Lightning flashed overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. Clara looked up at the stormy sky and made a decision that would change everything. "Then we better get started," she said. But neither of them knew that someone was already watching from the shadows, planning their next move. 3 days later, Clara sat in the front seat of James's wagon, watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink and gold. They'd been traveling since before dawn, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Morrison's friends. James had been right to worry. Yesterday evening, 2 rough-looking men had come asking questions at the hotel where they'd spent the night. "How much farther?" Clara asked, one hand resting on her growing belly. The baby had been active all morning, kicking and squirming like it was excited about their adventure. "Should reach my ranch by sundown," James replied, guiding the horses around a rocky bend in the mountain road. "It's not much to look at, but it's got good water and thick walls." Clara smiled, thinking about having a real home again. But her smile faded when she heard the sound of horses galloping behind them. James heard it too. His whole body tensed as he looked back down the trail. "Company coming," he said quietly. "And they're riding hard." 3 men on horseback were gaining on them fast, dust clouds rising behind their horses like tiny tornadoes. Clara's heart sank when she recognized the man in front. Jack Morrison, Buck's older brother. She'd heard stories about Jack that made Buck seem gentle as a church mouse. "There's nowhere to hide on this road," James said, checking his gun. "Looks like we're gonna have to make a stand." Clara felt fear creeping up her throat like cold fingers. "What if they hurt the baby?" "They won't get the chance," James promised. But Clara could hear the worry in his voice. The 3 men caught up when the wagon reached a narrow part of the trail with steep rocks on both sides. Jack Morrison rode up beside them, his mean little eyes fixed on Clara like a cat watching a mouse. "Well, well," Jack said with a nasty grin. "If it isn't the woman who got my brother thrown in jail." "Your brother put himself in jail by breaking the law," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. Jack laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Buck told me all about you, lady. Said you need to learn some manners." James brought the wagon to a stop, his hand resting on his gun handle. "You boys lost? The trail back to town is behind you." "We ain't lost," said one of Jack's friends, a skinny man with yellow teeth. "We came to collect what Buck was owed." "Your brother wasn't owed anything," Clara said, anger making her brave. "Those papers were fake, and everyone knows it." Jack's grin got wider and meaner. "Maybe so, but see, Buck owes me money for getting him out of jail. And since he can't pay, I figure his woman can work it off." "I'm not his woman," Clara snapped. "I'm married to Mr. McKenna here, legal and proper." "That's so?" Jack looked at James with mock interest. "Well, Mr. McKenna, seems like you bought yourself some expensive trouble. Tell you what, hand over the woman and we'll let you ride away. Keep her, and things might get unpleasant." James never moved his eyes from Jack's face. "The lady stays with me." "Figured you'd say that," Jack said, his hand moving toward his gun. "Boys, looks like we're gonna have to." But Jack never finished his sentence. A loud voice boomed down from the rocks above them. "Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." Clara looked up in amazement to see Sheriff Bradley and 3 deputies positioned on the rocks overhead, all pointing rifles down at Jack and his men. "What the—" Jack started to say. "Sheriff Bradley, as I live and breathe," James called out, relief clear in his voice. "Sure am glad to see you." The sheriff climbed down from the rocks, keeping his rifle trained on Jack. "Got word you folks might be having trouble on the trail. Figured I'd ride out and make sure you got to your destination safe and sound." Jack's face had gone pale as milk. "Sheriff, we was just—" "Just what?" "Threatening a pregnant woman and her husband." Sheriff Bradley's voice was harder than winter ice. "Jack Morrison, you and your boys are under arrest for attempted robbery and threatening behavior." As the deputies put handcuffs on Jack and his friends, Clara felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she hadn't even known was there. For the first time since this whole mess started, she felt truly safe. "How did you know to find us here?" James asked the sheriff. Sheriff Bradley grinned. "Mrs. Henderson at the general store saw those three riding out of town this morning, looking like they meant trouble. She came straight to me. That woman's got eyes like a hawk and a memory like an elephant." Clara laughed. Actually laughed. For the first time in weeks. "Remind me to buy something nice from Mrs. Henderson's store next time we're in town." As they watched Jack Morrison and his friends being led away, Clara realized something important had changed inside her. She wasn't the same frightened woman who'd stood on that auction block just a few days ago. She'd fought back when threatened, made her own choices, and stood up for what was right. The baby kicked strongly inside her, and Clara smiled. "I think our little one is excited about seeing their new home," she told James. James smiled back, the worry finally leaving his eyes. "I think they're gonna love it. Wide open spaces, fresh air, and all the room in the world to grow up free." As their wagon rolled toward the setting sun, Clara placed her hand over her heart and felt her mother's cameo brooch through the fabric of her dress. She thought about all the women who'd come before her, who'd faced their own impossible choices and found the strength to keep going. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered to the wind. Behind them, the mountain trail was empty and peaceful. Ahead of them lay a new life full of possibilities that Clara was finally free to choose for herself. But the best part wasn't the freedom from other people's choices. It was discovering that she'd had the strength to make her own choices all along.